Welcome into the dark. There is a comforting lie we all tell ourselves when we lock our doors at night. We tell ourselves that evil is a loud, chaotic force. We believe that if danger comes, we will hear it approaching. We will have time to run, time to fight, time to scream. But the terrifying truth of the world is that true horror doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break down the door with a battle cry. Sometimes, it simply stands right behind you at an ATM. Sometimes, it knocks politely and asks to use your phone. Sometimes it waits for you in the stairwell of an ordinary office building. Tonight, we are going to examine for separate descents into the abyss. For stories where the mundane rituals of everyday life, cashing a paycheck, hosting a guest, taking out pocket money, or exploring a new city, shattered into unimaginable nightmares. Settle in. Check your locks. Let's begin. Part I. The Phantom in the Static. Los Angeles, the summer of 1988. The city was a sprawling neon-lit grid of ambition and anonymity. The nights were warm, the air thick with the smell of hot asphalt and ocean marine layers. For 20-year-old Matthew Chase, now was simply home. He was young, scraping by, navigating the delicate balancing act of paying rent and keeping the lights on. It was June 8th. The clock on the wall of the apartment Matthew shared with his close friend, Teresa Dahl, was ticking toward midnight. They had just finished dinner, returning to their quiet living space at roughly 11:45 p.m. It was the end of an ordinary Wednesday. But, as Matthew moved through the living room, his eyes caught something resting on the coffee table. His paycheck. His bank account was running dangerously low. He knew that depositing the check immediately meant the funds might clear a full 24 hours faster. It was a mundane, practical thought. The kind of thought that crosses our minds 1,000 times a week. Matthew grabbed the paper, grabbed his wallet, and told Teresa he was going to make a quick run to the automated teller machine, just 2 blocks down the street. Teresa hesitated. The midnight hour had cast a heavy shadow over the neighborhood. Even though the machine was only a brief walk away, a creeping sense of unease washed over her. She insisted he take her car, a 1983 Volkswagen GT II. It was safer behind the steel and glass of a vehicle. As he took the keys, she asked him for one small favor, to swing by the convenience store across the street from the bank and pick up some cat food. 15 minutes tops was the unspoken promise of an errand like this. Matthew walked out the door. The latch clicked shut. 30 minutes bled into an hour. The apartment remained silent. Teresa sat waiting, listening for the familiar rumble of the Volkswagen's engine. But the street below offered nothing but the distant hum of city traffic. Rationalizing the anxiety away, she assumed her friend was simply taking a late-night drive to clear his head, letting the cool wind blow through the open windows. Exhausted, she finally went to bed. When the morning sun pierced the blinds, Teresa woke up. The apartment was entirely too quiet. She walked down the hall and pushed open Matthew's bedroom door. The bed was perfectly made. He had never come home. A cold pan excised her chest. She immediately woke her brother, Steve, who shared the apartment with them. Together, they dialed the police, their voices trembling as they reported Matthew missing. But the response from the precinct was the standard, bureaucratic wall of apathy. Matthew was an adult male who had only been missing for a handful of hours. The officers refused to open an official investigation, citing the arbitrary rule that it was far too early to assume foul play. Teresa and Steve were left entirely on their own, and they were not going to wait. Desperation breeds ingenuity. Steve picked up the phone and dialed Matthew's bank. Deepening his voice, he bypassed the standard protocols, impersonating his missing roommate. He told the teller he was checking on recent activity, praying that the card had remained untouched in Matthew's wallet. The information the teller relayed made Steve's blood run cold. Throughout the black hours of the night, Matthew's debit card had been slid into multiple local atmos. Someone had been desperately trying to withdraw cash. One of those attempts was a request for $280. To a stranger, it might seem like a random number, but to Steve, it was a glaring, terrifying red flag. First, the daily withdrawal limit on that specific account was strictly capped beneath that amount. Second, Matthew's balance was hovering under $100. That was the entire reason he had gone into the night, to deposit the paycheck. Matthew knew his account was practically empty. He knew the daily limit. Why would he repeatedly punch in a request for money he knew didn't exist? He wouldn't. Not willingly. It was a silent scream. A digital distress signal pounded into a keypad by a young man who had a gun to his back or a knife to his ribs. Armed with this terrifying deduction, Teresa and Steve stormed back to the authorities. The narrative had shifted from a wandering 22-year-old to an active kidnapping. The police finally mobilized. In 1988, security cameras at automated teller machines were a rarity. Most machines were blind metal boxes. But by some dark stroke of luck, one of the locations where Matthew's card had been inserted possessed a lens. Detectives pulled the security tape and watched the grainy, low-resolution footage flicker onto the screen. There was Matthew. He was standing at the machine, but the image made the breath catch in the detectives' throats. Hovering immediately behind Matthew's shoulder, standing in a ringworm, impossibly close, was an unidentified man. The stranger was leaning in, his eyes locked onto the keypad, burning Matthew's personal identification number into his memory. The posture of the shadow behind Matthew screamed of coercion. The physical threat was palpable even through the degraded, ghostly green static of the CRT monitor. The police drafted to composite sketches of the phantom behind Matthew, broadcasting the blurry features across the city. But the city stared back in silence. No one recognized the face. A day and a half later, the digital trail sparked back to life. Matthew's paycheck had finally cleared. The trap had been set, and the predator was waiting. The card was swallowed by another machine, and $400 vanished from the account. But this ATM was blind. There was no camera. The police instantly froze the assets. The next time the killer attempted to drain the funds, the machine coldly confiscated the plastic. Then came the agonizing limbo. Investigators spun theories. Perhaps Matthew had been bludgeoned during a mugging. Perhaps he was wandering the sun-baked streets of Los Angeles, a victim of trauma-induced amnesia, unaware of his own name. This flicker of hope was violently fanned when Teresa and Steve scoured the local rescue missions. Regulars at a soup kitchen swore they had seen a young man matching Matthew's exact description shuffling through the line for a hot meal. For 3 weeks, Matthew's parents clung to the desperate belief that their boy was simply lost in the concrete labyrinth of the city. Then, on June 27th, the illusion shattered. Teresa's bright red Volkswagen GTI was discovered abandoned on a street corner. It was parked chillingly close to the exact ATM where Matthew had last been recorded on camera. The police swarmed the vehicle, dusting every inch of glass, every curve of the steering wheel. But the killer was a ghost. The interior had been meticulously wiped clean of all fingerprints. There was only one piece of evidence left behind, sitting ominously on the back seat. A simple blue bandana. Scrawled across the fabric in crude lettering were the initials ESBBSCLS. Gang detectives immediately recognized the acronym. SBBS stood for the East Side Playboys, a ruthless streets syndicate operating violently within that territory. The authorities had a gang, but they didn't have a face. Without physical evidence or a witness willing to break the code of silence, the investigation ground to a suffocating halt. The changing of the seasons brought the final, devastating answer. 3 months after he walked out to deposit a check, Matthew Chase was found. His remains were discovered discarded deep within a dry, sun-scorched ravine in Pasadena. The medical examiner confirmed the family's worst nightmare. Matthew had not been wandering the streets with amnesia. He had been executed, shot once in the head. The decomposition proved he had been murdered within days, perhaps hours of his disappearance. The people at the mission had been mistaken. The case of Matthew Chase went dark. The files gathered dust. 10 years passed. 20. 30. For 3 decades, a family mourned a boy who simply went to run an errand and never came back. Then, in 2018, the silence was finally broken. The Los Angeles Police Department held a press conference to announce a monumental breakthrough. They had a name: David Bear Meza. Meza had been a 20-year-old enforcer for a gang in the Rampart area back in the summer of '88. The break came when Meza's former girlfriend finally stepped out of the shadows, examining that grainy, 30-year-old ATM photograph on definitively identifying her ex-boyfriend as the phantom standing over Matthew's shoulder. But justice in the Matthew Chase case is a fractured, whole thing. The police declared the case closed, but the timeline bleeds with an unresolved horror. David Bear Meza could not be tried for the murder. He was already in the ground. Just days after Matthew vanished, Meza was gunned down and killed in a violent drive-by shooting. And if Meza died just days after the abduction, who dumped Teresa S. red Volkswagen weeks later, who wiped the steering wheel clean? David Bear Meza did not act alone. Another shadow was waiting in the dark that night. Another killer walked free, carrying the secret of the dry ravine for over 30 years. Matthew Chase's loved ones finally have a name, but the full picture remains hidden in the static of a VHS tape, reminding us that sometimes the monsters who steal our loved ones simply vanish into the crowd. Port II. The dirt in the dark. Let us leave the neon of Los Angeles and travel across the country to the sweltering, humid coastline of Jacksonville, Florida. The year is 2005. James and Carol Sumner, known to everyone simply as Reggie and Carol, were the embodiment of Southern gentleness. At 61 years old, their twilight years had not been kind to their physical bodies. Reggie was battling severe diabetes, his energy waning with each passing month. Carol was in the fragile, terrifying stages of recovering from cancer. Seeking tranquility, they sold their longtime home in Charleston, South Carolina, and migrated south to Florida. They wanted nothing more than to live out their remaining days in quiet peace, sitting on the porch, enjoying the warmth of the sun. They were trusting. They were endlessly generous. And that generosity would be their death sentence. The catalyst for this nightmare was a young woman named Tiffany Cole. Tiffany was not a stranger. She was a ghost from their past. Her father had once lived right next door to the Sumners back in South Carolina. When Reggie and Carol packed up their lives, Tiffany approached them with a proposition. She wanted to buy an old car they were leaving behind. Knowing she didn't have the cash up front, the Sumners, trusting as ever, agreed to let her pay for the vehicle in monthly installments. Every so often, Tiffany would make the drive down to their new Jacksonville home to hand-deliver the cash. In June of 2005, she arrived at their doorstep accompanied by her boyfriend, a man named Michael James Jackson. Reggie and Carol didn't turn them away. They opened their door. They offered the young couple warm food. They offered them a soft bed to sleep in for the night. But as Michael sat at their dining table, smiling and making polite conversation, he was secretly calculating their worth. During the visit, he gleaned a crucial piece of information. The Sumners had recently finalized the sale of their South Carolina home. The profit was nearly $100,000. Michael looked at the frail, diabetic man and the cancer-recovering woman. He didn't see gracious hosts. He saw human piggy banks. They were isolated. They were weak. And they were rich. Michael and Tiffany returned to South Carolina, their minds poisoned by greed. For weeks, they sat in the sticky southern heat, meticulously drafting a blueprint for absolute devastation. They would doctor back to Florida, invade the home, torture the couple for their bank access codes, and drain their life savings. But there was a glaring flaw in the plan. Reggie and Carol knew exactly who they were. If Tiffany and Michael walked through that door, they would be immediately identified. They needed muscle. They needed strangers. They recruited to 18-year-old boys from their neighborhood, Alan Wade and Bruce Nixon. Young, impressionable, and entirely devoid of a moral compass, the teenagers agreed to become the physical instruments of the heist stunt. On the oppressive, humid night of July 8, 2005, the trap was sprung. Alan and Bruce stood on the Sumner's porch and knocked on the door. When Reggie answered, the boys put on a masterclass in manipulation. They claimed they were teenagers who had gotten hopelessly lost in the neighborhood. They asked with polite desperation if they could just use the telephone to call for a ride. Reggie, a man whose instinct was always to help, unlatched the screen door. He invited the wolves inside. The moment the door clicked shut, the illusion dropped. The boys unzipped a heavy black duffel bag they had carried inside. From the canvas depths, they produced thick rolls of silver duct tape, heavy leather gloves, and a remarkably realistic replica firearm. The terror that erupted in that quiet living room is unimaginable. The frail couple was violently shoved to the floor. The boys wrapped layer after layer of adhesive tape around their wrists, their ankles, and their mouths, suffocating their screams. Outside, parked in the suffocating darkness of the street, Michael and Tiffany sat slouched inside a rented Mercedes or X8. They kept their heads below the dashboard, watching the windows of the house like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. Inside, Alan and Bruce tore the house apart. They ripped through drawers, shattered cabinets, and hunted down every financial document, bank statement, and ATM card they could find. Once they had the keys to the kingdom, they dragged Reg and Carol's bound, trembling bodies through the house and forced them out into the garage. The teenagers popped the trunk of the Sumner's own vehicle, a heavy, luxurious Lincoln Town car. They hoisted the elderly man and woman into the dark, claustrophobic cavity of the trunk and slammed the lid shut. The convoy began to move. The rented monster took the lead, acting as a scout to draw the attention of any passing highway patrol. The Lincoln followed closely behind, carrying its captive cargo. Inside the pitch-black trunk, Reggie and Carol bounced against the metal chassis with every pothole, bound, gagged, and utterly terrified. At one point, the convoy pulled into a brightly lit gas station. Normal people were pumping fuel just feet away from the Lincoln. Inside the trunk, the Sumners must have prayed for someone to hear a muffled thump. But the pumps clicked off, the engines roared to life, and the cars pressed onward, crossing the state line into the desolate, sprawling backwoods of southern Georgia. Hours passed. The Lincoln eventually veered off the asphalt, tires crunching over dirt and broken branches, plunging deep into the suffocating canopy of the forest, and the engines died. The trunk was thrown open. Rough hands dragged Reggie and Carol out into the humid night air. They were thrown to the forest floor. Under the threat of absolute violence, they were forced to surrender the personal identification numbers to every single bank account they owned. But they were never going to be allowed to walk out of those woods. Days before they even knocked on the door in Florida, the four conspirators had driven to this exact spot with shovels in their hands. They had already dug the hole. The execution was not a spontaneous decision. It was the foundation of the entire plan. As they stood over the pit, Michael noticed something that enraged him. The duct tape wrapped around the Sumners' heads had begun to peel away from the sweat and the humidity. Their eyes were exposed. They were looking right at him. Michael barked at the teenagers to fix it. He later coldly admitted to investigators that he didn't want the couple looking at his face when they died. It was a mind thing, he stated, devoid of an ounce of humanity. The tape was violently wrapped back over their eyes, plunging them into absolute darkness. Alan and Bruce forced the fragile, sick couple to lie down at the bottom of the earthen pit. And then, the dirt began to fall. They did not shoot them. They did not stab them. They simply picked up the shovels and began raining heavy, wet Georgia soil down upon their living bodies. The killers tossed their shovels aside, abandoned the Lincoln in a nearby field, and drove back to Jacksonville. They walked back into the empty home, stole the couple's desktop computer to pawn for pocket change, and began the celebration. Over the next several days, the group went on a grotesque spending spree. They traveled from ATM to ATM across the state of Florida, draining thousands of dollars from their accounts. Surveillance cameras captured Michael Jackson holding Reggie's debit card, withdrawing stacks of cash that the group immediately blew on luxury limousine rides and bottles of expensive champagne. But a neighbor noticed the Sumners' garage, or left wide open. The house was dead quiet. 2 days after the abduction, a missing persons report was filed. Knowing the heat was turning up, the killers attempted one of the most brazen, insulting diversions in criminal history. They placed a phone call to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. The recording of that call is a chilling artifact of pure sociopath. A male voice, attempting a calm, concerned tone, spoke to the dispatcher. "How you doing? My name is Ricky. I'm out of town. My wife right now, her sister passed away. A friend of ours that lives in the neighborhood called this morning and said that the garage was open and that the lady was missing. We just moved, actually, to there not long ago from South Carolina. Do you have anybody that we can contact to help us make sure that everything is in the house that should be there whilst that should be there?" The dispatcher asked if he had local family. No, sir," the voice replied smoothly. My family lives in another state. It was a masterclass in deception, designed to buy them time. But when investigators played that audio recording for the Sumners' adult daughter, Rhonda, she broke down. The cadence, the tone, the vocabulary. It wasn't her father. It was the voice of a monster. The digital footprint of greed is impossible to erase. On July 14th, detectives tracked the relentless ATM withdrawals straight to a cheap motel room in Charleston, South Carolina. The police breached the door. Inside, they found Michael, Tiffany, and Alan, surrounded by the stolen remnants of the Sumners' lives. Bruce Nixon was apprehended shortly after back in Jacksonville. The bravado of the teenage muscle dissolved instantly in the interrogation room. Bruce quacked. He spilled every horrific detail of the plot, the abduction, and the terrifying journey into the woods. 8 days after they were taken from their home, investigators followed Bruce's directions to that desolate stretch of Georgia timberland. They began to dig. When they unearthed the bodies, the scene shattered the hearts of seasoned law enforcement veterans. At the bottom of that shallow pit, Reggie and Carol Sumner were not lying flat. They were intertwined. As the darkness consumed them and the dirt rained down, they had reached out for one another. They were found holding each other in a final, desperate embrace. Even as the breath was crushed from their lungs, they refused to let go. The autopsy report was a document of pure nightmare. The medical examiner confirmed the darkest fear. The dirt had been inhaled. Thick layers of sand and soil were packed tightly into their throats and deep within their airways. They had not been crushed by the weight of the earth. They had suffocated, agonizingly slowly, pulling the dirt into their lungs as they fought for oxygen. The trials were a circus of finger-pointing and cowardly denials. Tiffany Cole wept in front of the jury, playing the victim, insisting that Michael was a mastermind who had dragged her into the abyss against her will. She claimed she had no idea murder was on the agenda. The prosecution destroyed her narrative with a simple question. If she was so innocent, why did she impersonate Carol Sumner on the phone to the police? Why did she clink glasses of champagne paid for with blood money? In 2007, the hammer fell. Michael, Tiffany, and Alan were convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. All three were sentenced to death. Bruce Nixon, the one who broke the silence, was handed 45 years in prison. But the legal system is a winding, frustrating road. In 2016, the United States Supreme Court struck down Florida's death penalty protocol, ruling that allowing non-unanimous jury votes to condemn a prisoner was unconstitutional. The sentences were wiped out. The families were right back into the courtroom for resentencing. In 2022, Alan Wade stood before a judge and claimed the boy who dug that grave no longer existed. He was spared the needle, sentenced instead to life without the possibility of parole. In August of 2023, the courts reaffirmed Michael Jackson's status as the orchestrator of the slaughter. He was sent back to death row. Days later, Tiffany Cole's fate rested in the hands of a new jury. By a vote of 10-2, she was spared execution. She will rot in a concrete cell for the rest of her natural life, breathing the air that Reggie and Carol were denied. Port III, the unseen director. Fear has a specific texture. It is the cold sweat that prickles the back of your neck when you know you are being watched, but you cannot see the eyes staring at you. Our third story takes us to the blistering, sun-baked bowl of Phoenix, Arizona, in the summer of 2014. William and Barbara Singer were the kind of people who anchored a community. William, 81 years old, was a retired helicopter pilot who had spent his younger days slicing through the skies of Chicago, training the city's bravest emergency responders. His wife, 64-year-old Barbara, was a career nurse, a woman whose entire life's work was dedicated to easing the suffering of others. They had earned their retirement. They lived simply in a modest, unassuming home near the intersection of 35th Avenue and Bell Road. Their neighbors adored them. They were described as gentle souls, deeply devoted to one another, living quietly as their physical health began to wane with age. They had no debts. They had no enemies. They were a couple fading gracefully into the sunset of their lives. But on the suffocatingly hot night of June 28th, 2014, the rhythm of their peaceful existence shattered. At approximately 10:30 p.m., The security cameras mounted outside a local Wells Fargo bank clicked, capturing motion at the ATM. It was William and Barbara. Immediately, the context of the footage was wrong. The singers were elderly, dealing with failing health. They categorically did not leave the safety of their home after dark. Yet here they were, standing under the harsh fluorescent glare of the bank awning in the middle of the night. But it was their behavior on the tape that charred detectives to the bone. They were not acting like a couple running a simple errand. They approached the machine separately, rigidly taking turns to withdraw cash. As the tape rolled, investigators scrutinized William's body language. The former pilot looked stiff, terrified. His eyes darted nervously just beyond the edge of the camera's frame. He looked exactly like a man taking instructions from a monster standing just out of sight. The police are certain that William and Barbara were not alone in the dark that night. Someone was standing in the shadows of the parking lot, holding a weapon, whispering commands, forcing the terrified couple to drain their accounts. 4 days crawled by. The scorching Arizona sun beat down on the singer's quiet street. The neighbors began to notice an unnatural silence radiating from the house. No movement, no lights flickering in the evening. On July 2nd, a concerned neighbor dialed the police, requesting a welfare check. A patrol cruiser rolled up to the curb. The officers walked up the driveway and knocked. Silence. They breached the front door. The smell of copper and death hit them instantly. The interior of the modest home was a slaughterhouse. William was found slumped violently in a chair in one room. Barbara was discovered discarded in another. The killer had deliberately separated the husband and wife before unleashing hell. The crime scene told a story of absolute, frantic brutality. Furniture was overturned. Blood painted the walls. As one seasoned detective grimly stated to the press, the pair had not been dispatched quickly or cleanly. They had been butchered. But the physical evidence made the blood run cold. The officers examined the perimeter of the house. The windows were perfectly intact. The door frames were unsplintered. The deadbolts were undamaged. There was absolutely zero sign of forced entry. This meant one of two terrifying scenarios had played out. Either the shadow from the ATM had silently stalked the couple through the dark streets, waiting until they unlocked their front door before rushing them from behind and pushing his way inside. Or, even worse, the killer had climbed into the back seat of their car at the bank, pressed a blade to the back of William's neck, and forced the elderly pilot to drive his own executioner home. The surveillance footage from the Wells Fargo machine remains the burning core of the investigation. It is a haunting, silent movie capturing the final moments of normalcy before the horror began. It is the only physical tether the police have to the ghost who destroyed the singers. Detectives scoured the neighborhood, knocking on doors, desperate for a thread to pull. A few neighbors recalled a creeping sense of unease in the days leading up to the slaughter. They reported seeing strange men lingering on the sidewalks, individuals who didn't belong, men masquerading in the uniforms of utility workers, watching the houses with predatory interest. The police artists drafted composite sketches of these phantoms, releasing the faces to the media, praying for the phone to ring. But the leads evaporated like water on hot asphalt. Years have passed. William Singer Jr. has spent a decade standing before microphones, his voice cracking, begging the public to search their memories. He speaks of a mother and father who healed the sick and flew into danger to save lives. He speaks of two people who deserved to close their eyes in a peaceful, natural sleep. Instead, their home became an abattoir. The shadow just out of frame at the ATM remains unidentified, walking free, carrying the blood of a nurse and a pilot on his hands. Part IV, the utility cupboard. Our final story crosses the ocean, taking us to the vibrant, bustling streets of Auckland, New Zealand. It is September 1998. 29-year-old Kayo Matsuosta was living a dream. She had traveled from the snowy mountains of Yamagata, Japan, to the lush landscapes of New Zealand to study English. For a year, she had immersed herself in the culture of Christchurch, building a reputation as a radiant, endlessly cheerful young woman. Her friends described her as a magnetic personality, someone who dissolved cultural barriers with a simple smile, the kind of girl who could strike up a conversation with anyone and leave them feeling like a lifelong friend. As her time abroad drew to a close, Kayo decided to explore the Northern Island. Auckland was meant to be just another exciting pin on the map. She was a meticulous correspondent, writing detailed postcards to her mother back in Japan. In every letter, she made the same promise: I will be home in November. Do not worry, New Zealand is the safest place in the world. On Friday, September 11th, the midday sun hung high over Auckland as KOS flight touched down. She gathered her luggage and boarded the airport shuttle into the heart of the city. At exactly 12:14 p.m., a security camera mounted outside a bank caught her stepping off the bus onto the bustling pavement of Queen Street. She looked energized, ready to conquer the city. She walked a short distance and checked into a bustling backpackers hostel located on 4th Street. She paid for 3 nights, walked into her shared dormitory, and neatly, methodically unpacked her belongings, laying out her clothes for the weekend. Roughly an hour later, unable to resist the pull of the city, she grabbed her handbag and walked back out the front doors of the hostel to explore. At 3:32 p.m., the unblinking eye of a BNZ Bank security camera recorded Kayo walking briskly past the sprawling glass facade of the countrywide building. It was a mere 2-minute stroll from her bed at the hostel. She was alone, blending into the afternoon crowd of businessmen and tourists. That grainy, time-stamped frame of video is the absolute last time Kayo Matsuosta was ever seen alive. The weekend passed. The bed in the 4th Street hostel remained unslept in. Her neatly folded clothes remained untouched. Her friends in Christchurch grew worried when the cheerful phone calls suddenly ceased. On September 16th, 5 days after she vanished into the crowd, a sanitation worker emptying a public rubbish bin on Albert Street made a curious discovery. Discarded amongst the food wrappers and coffee cups was a woman's handbag. Inside, neatly tucked away, was a Japanese passport and a stack of travel insurance papers. The name on the passport was Kayo Matsuosta. A cold dread settled over the police department, but the city kept moving. 6 more days passed in agonizing silence. On September 22nd, a fire alarm technician was performing a routine inspection inside the Center Court building, a massive commercial complex located at 131 Queen Street. The building was a labyrinth of interconnected architecture, sharing a confusing, Escher-like network of stairwells, service corridors, and access doors with the adjacent BNZ building. The technician navigated to a desolate, rarely used stairwell and approached a heavy wooden door that concealed a small utility cupboard. He turned the handle and pulled the door open. Instantly, he recoiled. A vicious, eye-watering stench assaulted his senses, a heavy, chemical odor that smelled overpoweringly like ammonia. Before his brain could process the smell, a pale, rigid figure tumbled out of the darkness of the narrow closet, crashing violently onto the concrete floor at his feet. The technician let out a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a split second, his mind offered him a merciful rationalization. It's a mannequin. Someone shoved a department store mannequin in the closet as a joke. He took a trembling step forward and looked closer. The illusion shattered. It was not a mannequin. It was the naked, heavily decomposed body of a young woman. It was Kayo Mo. The crime scene was a geographical nightmare for detectives. The utility cupboard was tucked away in a liminal space that could be accessed from a dozen different directions. A killer could have dragged her through a bustling food court, slipped in from an adjacent pub, or carried her up from an underground car park. While some of the heavier doors required electronic swipe cards, building employees openly admitted to the police that strangers regularly tailgate their way through the side entrances undetected. The specific door to the cupboard itself possessed a lock, but it was a cheap mechanism that could be easily defeated with nothing more than a flathead screwdriver. The autopsy provided more agonizing mysteries than answers. Because she had been locked in an unventilated, warm closet for 11 days, the decomposition was severe. The pathologist could not definitively state how KO's life had been extinguished. Was she strangled, suffocated, poisoned? The physical trauma was erased by time. But she did not go quietly into the dark. Beneath her fingernails, the technicians found microscopic scrapings of skin. Male DNA. Kayo had fought like hell against the monster who took her. Yet, the killer had taken trophies. Every single piece of clothing she was wearing in that 3:32 p.m. photograph was gone. Her delicate, crescent-shaped silver earrings were missing. A distinct gold ring featuring a bright pink stone had been stripped from her finger. None of these items were ever found. Detectives swirled with theories. Did she wander into the QF oven attached to the building? Was her drink spiked with a chemical agent? Our friends vehemently rejected the idea. Kyle was a notoriously light drinker who struggled to finish a single beer. She was not the type to sit at a bar alone. But her friend, Naomi, offered a chilling insight into KO's greatest vulnerability, her absolute faith in people. She was the kind of person who could easily make friends, Naomi explained. She wasn't shy, and her English was very good. Kyo did not run into a dark alley. She met someone in the bright light of day. Someone charming, someone who smiled, struck up a conversation, and convinced her to step out of the crowd and walk through a side door. As the investigation deepened, the terrifying competence of the killer came into sharp focus. Detectives requested the digital logs for the electronic swipe card doors in the center court and BNZ buildings, hoping to track the movements in the stairwells on the weekend of her murder. The logs were gone. The entire electronic system had been intentionally wiped clean. Even the physical paper printouts kept by security had vanished. This was not a crime of passion. This was an engineered slaughter. Furthermore, the timeline was chilling. KO's handbag was found in a public bin 5 days after she disappeared. That meant the killer had kept her bag as a trophy, waited nearly a week, and then brazenly walked back out into the city streets to dispose of the evidence while her body continued to rot in the cupboard nearby. He was meticulous. There were no stray fingerprints on the door handle, no rogue hairs, nothing but the DNA trapped under her fighting nails. But one glaring detail stood out to criminal profiles. The killer went to extraordinary lengths to hide the body in a bizarre, high-risk location. But he never removed her from the building. The attached car bark offered a perfect exit strategy. The fact that he left her in the closet suggested he did not have access to a vehicle. Was he a local worker who rode the bus? Or perhaps another tourist passing through the hostels? The suspect list grew and shrank over the years. The fire alarm technician was heavily scrutinized and cleared. An employee of a language school located inside the building was investigated and dismissed. Even a British naval trainer who was later convicted of a brutal murder back in the yokai was looked at. But the timelines didn't match. For a terrifying window of time, the crusher settled on a deeply eccentric Ukrainian backpacker who had been renting a bed at KO's exact hostel. Witnesses claimed to have seen the man aggressively chatting with an East Asian woman the day KO vanished. Alarmingly, he was later spotted attempting to pawn female jewelry. And the most damning coincidence of all, the Ukrainian man abruptly packed his bags and fled New Zealand on the exact same day KO's body tumbled out of the cupboard. Interpol hunted the man down 2 years later. They dragged him into an interrogation room. They found the jewelry he had pawned, but the ring didn't have a pink stone. The earrings weren't silver crescents. The DNA under KO's nails did not match his blood. He was a deeply disturbed man, but he was not the killer. The trail went ice cold. Until 20 years later. In 2018, the Auckland police stood before the media and dropped a bombshell. They had uncovered a new thread. Deep within the banking records, they found a transaction. A specific, unnamed man had used his bank card at the ATM located inside the BNZ building on the exact afternoon Kyo disappeared. This placed a highly viable suspect squarely inside the labyrinth of the crime scene, mere steps from the utility cupboard at the precise hour Kyo vanished. The police refused to release the surveillance images of this man to the public. They refused to state his name or detail why his profile fit the killer so perfectly. They simply stated he was a promising match. But the words of lead investigator Scott Beard paint a horrifying portrait of the man they are hunting. "We believe it was someone who was quite confident," Beard stated grimly. "Well enough to talk to a Japanese tourist. Somebody who was charming. Who somehow gave her the confidence to speak to them, and maybe even go with them." The authorities believe that the absolute lack of forensic evidence, the wiped security systems, and the icy composure required to hide a body in a bustling commercial building point to one terrifying conclusion. Kayamotsu Osta did not meet a man making a mistake. She walked into the web of an active serial killer. In the snowy mountains of Yamagata, a mother still waits for a daughter who promised to come home in November. She remembers a girl whose laughter could light up a room, whose only fatal flaw was believing that the world was as kind as she was. KO's life ended less than 2 minutes from the safety of her bed, swallowed by a concrete stairwell in the middle of a busy afternoon. The monster who charmed her into the shadows has never been caught. We tell ourselves we are safe in the light. We tell ourselves that monsters only exist in the dark, deserted alleys at midnight. But as we've seen tonight, they are standing at the ATM. They are knocking on the front door. They are smiling at us on a crowded city street at 3 in the afternoon. Thank you for joining me in the dark tonight. Remember to lock your doors, be careful who you trust, and I will see you all again very soon. Welcome to the spaces where the world fractures. We like to believe that reality is a solid, predictable thing. We trust that the ground will hold our weight, that the people we watch on our screens are safe behind the glass, that the dead stay buried, and that when tragedy strikes, the living will respond with basic human decency. But what happens when those unspoken rules disintegrate? What happens when a sunny Friday morning is interrupted by a grotesque display of madness? Or when thousands of people log onto a website to gleefully watch a man be tortured to death? What happens when a dead friend sends you an email to tell you he is watching? Tonight we are pulling back the curtain on for distinct, deeply unsettling fractures in realities. These are stories of human depravity, digital exploitation, dark web anomalies, and ghosts lingering in the machine. Knock your doors. Lower the blinds. Let's begin. Part I. The Wasco Nightmare. The Central Valley of California is defined by its stretches of agricultural land, its quiet industrial hubs, and its predictable routines. The city of Wasco is one of these places. A tight-knit community where the mornings usually unfold with a quiet, mundane rhythm. Mornings. Friday, March 22, 2024, was supposed to be exactly that. The early morning sun was just beginning to burn off the chill in the air as residents headed to work, grabbed their coffees, and waited for the day to begin. At the Amtrak station near the intersection of G Street and 7th, 48-year-old Horacio Ayala Penaloza was starting his morning. Horacio was a fixture in Kern County, a man who had spent years building a quiet, unassuming life there. His neighbors knew him as a hard-working, deeply private individual who kept his head down and bothered no one. He was well liked, the kind of man who offered a polite nod to passers-by. On this particular morning, Horacio was standing near a bench, casually gripping the handlebars of his bicycle, engaged in a light, passing conversation with an acquaintance. It was just after 8:00 on. In the distance, the heavy, vibrating rumble of an approaching Amtrak train began to shake the ground. Trains are a fact of life in Wasco. The blare of the horn and the rhythmic clacking of steel on steel are just background noise. But in a fraction of a second, the background noise turned into a deafening, catastrophic roar. Witnesses would later struggle to articulate the sheer suddenness of the violence. Horacio had drifted too close to the edge. He took a step, perhaps losing his footing, perhaps misjudging the distance of the massive, speeding locomotive. 1 second he was a living, breathing man chatting by a bench. The next, a terrifying collision of physics and human frailty occurred. The impact was absolute. Horacio's body was caught in the unforgiving machinery of the train, resulting in a devastating, catastrophic trauma that ended his life in a burst of kinetic violence. The train screeched to a halt. The morning air was suddenly filled with the scent of hot iron, ozone, and copper. Bystanders were frozen, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes wide with the trauma of what they had just witnessed. Sirens began to wail in the distance. The police and emergency responders were rushing to secure the horrific scene, to bring dignity to Horacio's remains, and to process the tragic accident. But the horror of that morning had not yet peaked. From the periphery of the carnage, a new shadow emerged. His name was Rosendo Teles. He was 27 years old, a transient man known to the local authorities, carrying an active warrant for his arrest. Just hours earlier, security cameras at a nearby liquor store had recorded him acting completely lucid, blending in with the morning customers. Now, he was wandering aimlessly through the perimeter of a fatal train collision. As Teles navigated the debris field, his eyes locked onto a piece of the wreckage lying near the tracks. It was one of Horacio's severed legs, amputated during the violent strike. What a normal human mind does in this situation is look away. We recoil. We protect our sanity from the visceral reality of death. Tales did not recoil. He bent down, wrapped his hands around the torn limb, and hoisted it into the air. What followed was a display of macabre madness so profound it left seasoned law enforcement officers entirely speechless. In the broad daylight of a California morning, Rosendo Tales began to parade through the streets of Wasco, carrying the severed leg. He didn't hide it. He brandished it like a hunting trophy. A crew of construction workers, wearing hard hats and neon vests, stood paralyzed by their vehicles. They watched as Tales strutted past them. He lifted the leg to his face and inhaled deeply, sniffing the torn flesh. Then, in a sudden burst of erratic energy, he swung the limb through the air, laughing hysterically, before violently slamming it against a nearby concrete wall. It was not a fleeting psychotic break. It was a sustained, deliberate performance. Witnesses pulled out their phones, their hands shaking, capturing footage that would soon go viral and scar the internet. In the videos, Tales can be seen aggressively waving the foot at terrified pedestrians. And then the ultimate boundary of human decency was crossed. Tales raised the leg to his mouth. He tore into the flesh with his teeth. He was chewing. He shrieked at the onlookers, taunting them, his mouth stained, daring anyone to step forward and intervene. All of this unfolded mere steps away from the railroad investigators and sheriff's deputies who were painstakingly trying to document Horatio West's death. Word of the nightmare unfolding down the block reached the deputies. They abandoned the tracks and closed in on the intersection of 7th and F Street. As the officers surrounded him, their weapons drawn, their stomachs churning, one deputy shouted at Tales, demanding to know whose foot he was holding. Tales looked at the officers, a dark, chaotic gleam in his eye, and smirked. "My own," he replied. He was wrestled to the concrete and placed in handcuffs. The partially gnawed remains were recovered and covered from the public eye. The investigation quickly confirmed that Tales had absolutely nothing to do with Horatio West's initial death. The train strike was a tragic, heartbreaking accident. Tales was simply an opportunistic monster who happened to be standing on the right street corner at the wrong time. When questioned in custody, still wearing the handcuffs, Tales nonchalantly claimed he was just trying to be helpful. He told the police he was taking the leg to the local hospital. The booking process revealed a massive cocktail of controlled substances hidden on his person, drugs he was attempting to smuggle right into the county jail. The narcotics had undeniably fueled his depraved actions that morning, silencing whatever tiny voice of reason remained in his head. He was charged with a litany of offenses, including the bizarre statute of removing human remains from a location outside of a cemetery, destruction of evidence, and resisting an officer. The media circus that followed was intense, but it focused entirely on the ghoul, eclipsing the victim. Horatio Ayala Penaloza was a man who mattered. He was a man whose life ended in a terrifying instant, only to have his dignity stolen by a passing stranger. And the justice system's response. It was a final, bitter insult. In May of 2024, mere weeks after chewing on a human being in the street, Rosendo Tales entered a no-contest plea. The judge handed down a sentence of 1 single year in the county jail. Factoring in credit for time already served in standard good behavior protocols, the sentence evaporated. Rosendo Tales is already out. He is walking the streets right now, free to wander, free to watch, waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. Part II, the death broadcast. The internet can be a magnificent tool for building communities. For those who feel outcast by the physical world, the glow of a monitor can feel like a warm embrace. But that same digital ecosystem can become a terrifying psychological prison. It can transform human suffering into a highly profitable spectator sport. This brings us to the harrowing, agonizing story of Raphael G. Ravine. To the internet, he was known as Jean-Paul Minove, or simply JP. Raphael was a man who carried a heavy burden of trauma long before he ever pressed the Go Live button. He had spent his early adulthood serving in the French military. It was a brutal environment for a man like Raphael, who was naturally awkward, neurodivergent, and deeply desperate for acceptance. The military did not offer him brotherhood. It offered him relentless, crushing bullying. He was a square peg being violently hammered into a round hole. When his service ended, he retreated. He found refuge in the world of online streaming. Raphael began playing video games and talking directly into his webcam. He was candid, vulnerable, and surprisingly funny. He didn't have the polished, hyper-produced veneer of a traditional influencer. He was raw, and the internet loved him for it. By the early 2020s, his Twitch channel had exploded, amassing an audience of over 670,000 loyal followers. As the landscape of streaming evolved, the money in the audience began to shift toward a new platform called Kick. Kick was notorious. It was a digital Wild West, a platform bankrolled by cryptocurrency gambling empires, boasting incredibly loose moderation rules. Anything goes. Raphael made the jump to Kick, bringing his chaotic challenge segments and self-deprecating humor with him. By 2023, he was the undisputed king of French streaming on the platform, regularly charting among the most watched creators on the entire globe. But massive audiences attract predators. Enter to streamers who went by the aliases Naruto, real name Moens and AZ and Dottai, and Sof Ein Hamadi. Initially, their collaborations with Raphael seemed like standard for house content. It was edgy, loud, and full of chaotic stunts designed to appease the algorithm. But very quickly, the dynamics soured. The pranks morphed into calculated, systematic abuse. Raphael became their punching bag. The streams devolved into hours of Naruto and Sof Ein taunting him. The violence escalated from verbal barbs to physical assault. Live in front of tens of thousands of cheering viewers, Raphael was violently slapped across the face. He was drenched in unknown liquids. They brought out high-velocity paintball guns and shot him from point-blank range, leaving his skin covered in deep purple welts. They wired him to devices and shocked him with electricity. The most disturbing segments involved asphyxiation. They would grab Raphael by the throat and throttle him, actively trying to set suffocation records for the stream. In one terrifying clip, the violence went so far that even Naruto panicked, tearing Sof Ein's hands away from Raphael's neck and screaming, "Wait, he is gonna die." Both Naruto and Sof Ein knew a critical, terrifying secret. Raphael suffered from a severe, documented heart condition. Yet, the knowledge of his fragile health did not stop them. It emboldened them. The physical torture was paired with a relentless campaign of psychological destruction. They mocked his intelligence. They mimicked his speech difficulties. They viciously ridiculed his deepest, most vulnerable dream, to one day find a wife and start a family. When Raphael's father fell gravely ill, Naruto and Sof Ein secretly printed merchandise featuring the dying man's face and sold it to their audience for profit without telling him. They invited random teenagers from the internet into their studio for the sole purpose of pointing and laughing at Raphael. When Raphael received the devastating news that his beloved pet dog had died, they made sure the cameras were rolling so they could broadcast his tears, laughing hysterically at his grief. And the most terrifying part of this entire ordeal, the audience loved it. The crueler the abuse became, the higher the viewer count climbed. People were not tuning in to watch video games. They were tuning in to watch a human being be systematically broken down. They wanted to see the moment Raphael snapped, the moment he exploded in rage, only to be physically overpowered and put back in his place. Thousands of anonymous users flooded the chat with laughing emojis, throwing thousands of dollars in donations at the screen to fund the humiliation. It was a digital coliseum, and Raphael was the gladiator bleeding in the sand. Why didn't he just leave? Why didn't he turn off the computer? Because he was a hostage. Naruto and Sof Ein had executed a hostile takeover of his life. They controlled the channel. They routed the massive profits into their own pockets, keeping Raphael on a tight financial leash. They weaponized his deep, crippling loneliness. They convinced him that without them, he was nothing. They told him that if he walked away, he would end up freezing on the streets. On the rare occasions Raphael summoned the courage to rebel or refuse a stunt, they punished him. They would physically lock him out of the studio, steal the keys to his car, and relentlessly harass his family members until he surrendered and got back in front of the camera. The media eventually caught wind of the darkness. A French investigative journal named Mediapart published a scathing expose on the streams, prompting the police to knock on the studio. But the psychological conditioning was too deep. Raphael stood between his abusers and the detectives, desperately claiming it was all an act. He told the police the violence was staged, a clever bit of performance art to generate buzz. The police left, the door locked behind them. But Raphael's digital paper trail told the agonizing truth. In a desperate, secret text message sent to his mother, Raphael wrote, "Hi Mum, how are you? Stuck for a bit in Naruto's death game. It's going too far. I feel like I'm kidnapped with their shitty concept. I'm fed up, I want to get out of here. The other guy won't let me. He's keeping me locked in." He knew he was going to die. August 2025. The climax of the nightmare. Naruto and Sofan announced a Subathon, an Ultramontron broadcast, designed to run continuously for days on end, completely dictated by the financial donations of the audience. The stream stretched on for nearly 12 agonizing days. For almost 300 hours, the world watched Raphael Giravine wither away. He was subjected to severe, unrelenting sleep deprivation. His abusers beat him. They forced him to ingest toxic, sickening products on camera. As the days blurred together, his speech devolved into an incomprehensible slur. His eyes were sunken. His skin was grey. His heart was failing. Naruto recognized the impending catastrophe, but instead of calling an ambulance, he decided to secure his legal defense live on the air. With the camera focused on Raphael's trembling, exhausted face, Naruto barked a command. "Say on camera right now that if you die tomorrow in the middle of a live stream, it's because of your state of health and not because of us." Raphael, summoning a sliver of defiance, refused. Naruto leaned in, his voice dripping with venom. "We're in the middle of a live show. You get angry, start screaming, and go into cardiac arrest. People are gonna take it out on us when it's due to your 46 years of miserable life." On August 18th, the on-screen counter displayed over 36,000 euros in donations. Raphael began to clutch his chest. He was gasping for air. His lungs were failing to pull in oxygen. He looked into the lens and quietly begged to be taken to the hospital. Naruto and Sofan ignored him. Minutes later, Raphael Giravine collapsed. His body hit the floor. Dead weight. His friends did not flinch. They did not reach for a phone. They left the camera running, pointing directly at his motionless body, and calmly walked to their beds in the very same room to go to sleep. The chat exploded. Panicked viewers hurled massive cash donations at the screen, using the automated text-to-speech features to scream through the studio speakers, begging Naruto to wake up and check on Raphael's pulse. 50 minutes passed. 50 minutes of a man lying dying on the floor. Finally, Naruto stirred. He picked up a heavy plastic water bottle and hurled it across the room, striking Raphael violently in the head. "Is he dead?" Naruto muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He's been. When Raphael didn't flinch from the impact, the reality finally set. The abuser scrambled out of bed. The atmosphere in the room shifted from callous annoyance to sheer, naked panic. They checked his vital signs. Nothing. The stream abruptly cut to black. Hours later, the damage control began. Naruto posted a sickeningly hollow announcement on Instagram. "Unfortunately, JP has left us. I love you, my brother, and we will miss you terribly." He immediately begged the audience not to share the clips of Raphael's collapse, claiming it was out of respect, a transparent, pathetic attempt to erase the digital evidence of his own complicity. The autopsy results provided a legal shield for the abusers. There was no blunt for trauma that definitively ended his life. The coroner ruled the cause of death was highly likely medical and toxicological in nature. His fragile heart, battered by 12 days of stress, toxins, and sleep deprivation, simply stopped beating. The fallout was a masterclass in corporate negligence. Kick, a platform built on the promise of absolute freedom, scrambled to cover its tracks. They banned the accounts of Naruto and Sofan, but inexplicably allowed Raphael's channel to be reinstated. More disgustingly, the executives at Kick manually scrubbed their own servers, deleting every single clip that showed the torture, the abuse, and the collapse. They only left the videos that fit their carefully curated narrative. The videos where Raphael was smiling, the videos where he appeared to be a willing participant. Before his death, Kick had actively profited off the abuse. They had plastered Raphael's bruised, muddy face on their official merchandise. They tweeted about him, comparing his endurance to the superhero Deadpool. They acted like a dystopian corporation ripped straight from the darkest depths of science fiction, monetizing human suffering until the very last breath. Two of Kick's most prominent figures, streamer Adin Ross and the musician Drake, who holds massive financial ties to the gambling company stake that funds Kick, stepped forward to announce they would pay for Raphael's funeral. To the public, it was an insulting PR stunt, throwing pennies at a grave they helped dig. The French government was furious. The digital ministry blasted Kick's complete lack of moderation, threatening the company with a staggering $49.5 million fine. Politicians seized the tragedy as a political football, using Raphael's death as an excuse to push for draconian internet surveillance laws, completely ignoring the fact that French regulators had been explicitly warned about the streams a full year prior and did absolutely nothing. The legal battle was a nightmare. Prosecutors could not charge Naruto and Saw Fine with murder. Instead, they opened an investigation into abuse of weakness, a specific French statute applied when a vulnerable person is maliciously exploited. The defense lawyers for the abusers are aggressive. They claim Raphael died of natural causes. They claim he consented to every single second of the broadcast. This argument ignores a fundamental pillar of French law: you cannot legally consent to being tortured. But the most shocking betrayal occurred at Raphael's own funeral. As Naruto and Saw Fine stood among the mourners, playing the role of grieving friends, Raphael's mother took to the podium. To the absolute horror of everyone in attendance, she defended the men who killed her son. Naruto and Saw, I took good care of my son just as I did, she told the crowd, entirely dismissing the desperate text message her son had sent her son. They have values. JP was able to do things with them that he wasn't able to do back home. They never mistreated him except once in the gym. What happens in the live stream is in the live stream. What happens off the live stream is off the live stream. When they go home, they don't take their work home with them. Raphael's sister sat in the pews, weeping, later describing the abuser's behavior as utterly unforgivable and unacceptable. Raphael Jaravine was a man who wanted a family. He wanted friends. He was broken down by men decades younger than him, stripped of his dignity, and turned into a carnival attraction for thousands of cheering sociopaths. As one commenter perfectly summarized the tragedy, he was killed on the inside before his actual death, and the men who killed him are currently playing the victims. Part II, the cult in the code. Sometimes the internet doesn't show you a live tragedy. Sometimes it leaves a puzzle behind, a digital artifact so deeply unsettling that it burrows into your subconscious and refuses to leave us. If you open your web browser right now, clear the address bar, and type in the words "this is not a cult," XYZ, you will not find a normal website. There is no navigation menu. There is no About Us page. There is no contact information. When the page loads, your screen will plunge into absolute, pitch-black darkness. In the dead center of the monitor is a single, solitary icon, a white play button. The URL itself is a psychological trick. Telling someone it is not a cult only guarantees that they will click. If you press play, you are greeted by nearly 20 seconds of absolute, dead silence. The screen remains dark, save for a layer of artificial, grainy static that dances across the pixels. You wait, leaning closer to the monitor, expecting a jump scare. But it doesn't jump. It fades in. A tight, claustrophobic close-up of a face fills the entire screen. But it is not a human face. Not anymore. It appears to be a mummified head. The skin is leathery, pulled terrifyingly tight over the bone structure. The bridge of the nose is violently flattened, caved into the skull. The lips have decayed or been pulled back, revealing a jutting, uneven row of teeth that look too sharp to be natural. But the worst part is the eyes. They are wide open. They are milky, vacant, and staring completely through the camera ends. The figure does not blink. It does not draw a breath. It is perfectly, terrifyingly still. At first, your brain tries to tell you it's just a photograph, a creepy Jap uploaded to scare teenagers. But, as you watch, The lighting subtly shifts. The camera angle drifts slightly, betraying the unsteady breathing of the person holding the lens. It is not a photograph. It is a live video recording. Someone is standing over this corpse, holding a camera inches from its face in the dark. And then the audio begins. It is a jarring, nightmarish juxtaposition. Drifting softly out of your speakers is the sound of a grand, angelic gospel choir. The music is hauntingly beautiful, a slow, swelling hymn of devotion. But layered violently over the top of the choir is a second track. It sounds like an animal. It sounds like a chimpanzee locked in a cage, grunting, panting, and suddenly erupting into violent, ragged screams. The audio loops, and the dissonance between the holy choir and the primal screaming makes your skin crawl. But the internet is full of curious minds. Audio engineers ripped the file from the website and dropped it into editing software. They isolated the screaming track. They highlighted the waveform, and they clicked reverse. When the audio is played backward and sped up by just a fraction, the blood turns to ice in your veins. It is not a chimpanzee. It is a human being. The grunts are the unmistakable, breathless cries of a man in absolute agony. Between the reversed, agonizing screams, you can clearly hear the heavy, metallic rattling of iron bars, the unmistakable clang of a cage being shaken. And just beneath the noise, the distinct crisp sound of someone's fingers fiddling with the dials of recording equipment. Someone locked a human being in a cage, recorded their suffering, reversed the audio to disguise the screams, and layered it over a gospel hymn. Hundreds of digital sleuths have scoured the internet, combing through YouTube archives and Spotify playlists, desperately trying to identify the beautiful choir music playing in the background. If they can find the song, perhaps they can trace the creator. But the track does not exist anywhere else. Listening closely, the lyrics seem to whisper, "He's my Lord, He's my Savior, in this world Prince of Peace." But typing those lyrics into Google yields absolutely nothing. It is a ghost track. The website remains active. The mummified face continues to stare out of the dark. And somewhere out there, the person who stood over that body and recorded those screams is waiting for you to click play. Part IV. The digital seance. We leave behind the malicious and the morbid, and step into a different kind of haunting. A story that forces us to ask what happens to our digital souls when our physical bodies are lowered into the earth. Jack Frost was 32 years old. He lived in the quiet town of Dunmore, Pennsylvania. He was the kind of guy who commanded a room, not with arrogance, but with a deep, magnetic warmth and a razor-sharp, sarcastic sense of humor. He was a force of nature, deeply passionate about his friends, his family, and the simple joy of being alive. In June of 2011, the universe made a cruel, abrupt calculation. Jack suffered a massive, sudden heart arrhythmia. Without warning, without a chance to say goodbye, his heart stopped beating. The shockwave of his sudden death devastated everyone who knew him. When an elderly person passes, there is a period of mental preparation. But when a vibrant, healthy 32-year-old drops dead, the grief is a suffocating, disorienting fog. His friends and family were left navigating a world that suddenly felt fundamentally broken. They were left with unfinished conversations, unreturned text messages, and the desperate, burning desire for just one more day with him. The summer faded into autumn. The heavy mantle of grief began to settle into a dull, persistent take. It was November 2011, 5 months after Jack had been buried. Tim Hart, one of Jack's oldest and closest childhood friends, sat down at his computer. He opened his web browser and logged into his email account, expecting the usual clutter of spam bills and work updates. He scrolled through his inbox. His eyes stopped on a single, unread message. The sender name read, Jack Frost. Tim's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the impossible data. The subject line of the email was 2 words. I'm watching. A cold trickle of adrenaline washed over him. With a trembling hand, Tim clicked the mouse and opened the email. The message inside was brief, brutal, and utterly terrifying in its specificity. Did you hear me? I am at your house. Clean your fucking attic. Tim sat back in his chair, completely paralyzed. This wasn't a generic spam message generated by a bot. This wasn't a random hack. This was personal. Before Jack died, he had visited Tim's house. The two friends had spent the afternoon hanging out, joking around near the entrance to the attic space. The attic was a disaster zone, filled with dusty boxes and clutter. Jack, with his signature sarcastic grin, had relentlessly teased Tim about the mess. They had shared a private laugh, with Jack jokingly threatening to climb up there and clean it himself if Tim was too lazy to do it. It was an incredibly obscure, highly specific private conversation. Nobody else in the world knew about the attic joke. Desperate, his heart pounding, Tim hit reply. He typed a frantic message into the void, begging for a response. He hit send. The void did not answer. The inbox remained empty. But Tim was not the only one receiving dispatches from the grave. Shortly after Tim's terrifying experience, Jack's cousin, a man named Jimmy McGraw, received a notification on his phone. An email from Jack first. Jimmy, still heavily grieving the loss of his cousin, opened the message. Hey Jim, how are you doing? I knew you were gonna break your ankle. Tried to warn you. Gotta be careful. Jimmy dropped his phone. A profound, dizzying sense of vertigo washed over him. Just 7 days prior to receiving that email, nearly 6 full months after Jack had been declared legally dead, Jimmy had tripped and suffered a severe fracture to his ankle. It was an event that occurred in the future. It was an impossibility. The internet caught wind of the story, and the digital forensics began. How does a dead man send an email about an event that hasn't happened yet? The skeptics immediately proposed the most rational theory: scheduled emails. Many email clients allow you to draft a message and set a timer for it to be delivered days, months, or even years in the future. Did Jack know he was sick? Did he write these emails as a final, elaborate prank to mess with his friends from the great beyond? The theory falls apart under scrutiny. Jack's death was a sudden, catastrophic cardiac event. He had absolutely no idea he was going to die. He wouldn't have had any reason to preemptively schedule a goodbye message. And more importantly, the scheduled email theory cannot explain the broken ankle. Jack could not have predicted that his cousin would trip and break a specific bone half a year after his own funeral. The second theory was malicious hacking. Did some depraved internet troll gain access to the account of a dead man and decide to torture his grieving family? Investigators looked into it. Jack was highly tech-savvy. His passwords were complex and entirely unshared. The email providers found absolutely zero evidence of illicit logins or IP addresses accessing the account from remote locations. Furthermore, the psychology of a hacker doesn't fit. Trolls operate on attention. They want to see the chaos they cause. But the phantom sender never came forward to claim the prank, and the emails abruptly stopped. And how could a random hacker in another country possibly know about a private joke regarding Tim's dirty attic? For some of Jack's friends, the explanation was simple. The emails were supernatural. They believed that Jack, possessing a spirit too loud and vibrant to be contained by a wooden casket, had somehow reached through the digital ether to offer them comfort, to let them know he was still around. But there is a final, profoundly human theory that has gained traction. When Jack died so suddenly, his belongings were gathered by his heartbroken mother. His laptop would have been returned to her, the battery eventually dying, the screen going black. But what if she plugged it in? What if she opened the lid? Jack's email accounts would likely still have been logged in, the browser tabs left open from the day he died. The theory suggests that Jack's mother, drowning in an ocean of grief, sat in front of his glowing screen. She wanted to keep his memory alive. She wanted his friends to smile. She knew about the attic joke. She knew Jimmy had broken his ankle. Perhaps she sat at the keyboard, channeling the sarcastic, loving voice of her dead son, and pressed send. Perhaps she thought it would bring them comfort, and simply underestimated the massive, viral panic it would cause. Whether it was a ghost in the machine, a glitch in the server, or a grieving mother trying to resurrect her boy in the digital space, the emails remain a cornerstone of internet folklore. When asked about the terror of receiving a message from a dead man, Jimmy McGraw offered a perspective of profound peace. "I like to think that Jack sent them." Jimmy smiled. "It's like he's gone but still trying to reach out. trying to tell me to move forward, to feel better. Even Jack's mother, whether she typed the words or not, found solace in the mystery. I saw. They made some people happy, she said. They upset some people too, but at least people were still talking about them. We live in an age where our physical bodies are fragile, but our digital footprints are immortal. We leave fragments of ourselves scattered across servers, hard drives, and chat logs. As you turn off your lights tonight, remember that the screen in your pocket is a window. Sometimes it shows you the monsters walking down the street in the broad daylight. Sometimes it shows you the predators hiding behind a smile. And sometimes, if you look closely enough into the static, it shows you that the dead aren't always gone. Thank you for stepping into the dark with me. Stay safe, keep your loved ones close, and I will see you all again very soon.